you have your Bibles with you, you're welcome to turn to 2 Samuel chapter 15. We'll be reading from there in a moment. I picked the sermon to talk about Bible heroes, and so the title is Ittai the Gittite, and I realize now that that's not a very stirring title, so I got to now work to try to convince you otherwise. I know Randy had quite a hard time trying to find a song about Ittai the Gittite. So last night my daughters were asking me what I was going to preach on, and I told them, and I'm like, have you ever heard of him? And Layla's like, nope. And Lena said, I don't think I've gotten there yet in the Bible. So it's maybe one of those subjects, but you'll see tonight as we talk about heroes, why it'll come from a story that you're familiar with, and you'll see the point of it, I think. I've been on this John Wayne kick lately. Been watching all these old Western movies, and John Wayne was the quintessential American hero. He was brave, he was loyal, he had integrity, and it was like if he knew something was the right thing to do, then it didn't matter. It didn't matter what the cost was to him personally. He made sure he did the right thing. And these are the same kind of traits that we often find in Bible heroes, that loyalty, integrity, and bravery. Tonight, we're going to talk about Ittai the Gittite. And in today's world, we're definitely in need of heroes. I think a study of the Old Testament heroes is a great way to get a glimpse into the characteristics of a true hero. We can see what the Bible reveals to us as a true hero. There's stories in the Bible that often give us doctrinal truth, or they'll show the fulfillment of a prophecy. But sometimes scriptures are just there to sort of memorialize the noble character demonstrated by certain characters in the Bible. I'll give you one example. In Matthew chapter 26, the woman came and she anointed Jesus. Remember, she used some alabaster oil, which was a costly oil. And a lot of the disciples were indignant because they thought that money could have been spent to help the poor instead. But Jesus said, "Assuredly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the entire world, what this woman has done will be told as a memorial for her." So it's good for us to identify true heroes and to learn what it means to live by faith, to have somebody for our kids to look up to, besides Hollywood actors and professional athletes. We should also study godly heroes because it gives us hope. Romans chapter 15, verse 4 says, "For whatever things were written before were written for our understanding, that we through the patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope." This evening, I want to look at the story of Ittai the Gittite. And to put the story in context, I'm going to start off with summarizing Absalom's rebellion, and we'll talk about David and when he fled from Jerusalem. We'll then look at some of the background of Ittai, and we'll talk about the Kerethites and the Pelethites and the Gittites, and we'll sort of understand them a little better. And then we'll conclude with the characteristics of why Ittai is a hero. So, reviewing Absalom's revolt, it was from 2 Samuel chapter 13, and Amnon was David's firstborn and heir to the throne. And so he laid with his half-sister Tamar against her will and then refused to marry her. And Tamar tore her ornamental robe, which was the sign that she was one of the virgin daughters of the king, and so there was no hiding what had been done. And Absalom was her full brother. He took her into his home, but he hated Amnon for what he had done. And David also found out what happened and was furious, but did nothing about it. 2 years later, Absalom hosted a party at his house centered on the shearing of his sheep. And he requested that David join him for the festivities, but David declined. And so Absalom asked if Amnon could come in his stead, since it was customary that the firstborn son could sit in place of the father. And David agreed. And so Absalom instructed his men to kill Amnon once he had well drunk, And after 2 years of plotting revenge, Absalom killed his half-brother and heir to the throne. After that, Absalom fled to his maternal grandfather's home in Geshur, and he stayed there for 3 years. And finally, David summoned him back to Jerusalem, but David refused to see him for 2 more years, and Joab convinced him to see him, and he came before the king, and they were reconciled. So it was 5 years since Absalom had murdered Amnon. Now, not content with his circumstances, Absalom began to build a political following. And so he would sit at the gate and he would campaign there. And when he was finally ready to make his move, he requested from his father that he go to Hebron to offer a sacrifice to thank God for letting him come back from exile. And what he did instead is when he went there and he was 20 miles away from Jerusalem and in a city with high walls, he sent out messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to proclaim that he was king. And so implied in that, implicit in that proclamation was a call of arms for everybody that supported Absalom. So it became apparent that the coup would succeed when a messenger arrived in Jerusalem and told King David, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. And so that's kind of where our story picks up tonight. So at this time we'll read 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 13 through 23. Now a messenger came to David saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." So David said to his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword." And the king's servants said to the king, "We are your servants, ready to do whatever my lord the king commands." Then the king went out with all his household after him, but the king left 10 women, concubines, to keep the house. And the king went out with all the people after him and stopped at the outskirts. Then all his servants passed before him, and all the Kerethites, all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men who had followed him from Gath, passed before the king. Then the king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why are you also going with us? Return and remain with the king. For you are a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. In fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today, since I go I know not where? Return and take your brethren back. Mercy and truth be with you." But Ittai answered and said, "As the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also your servant will be." So David said to Ittai, "Go and cross over." Then Ittai the Gittite and all his men and all the little ones who were with them crossed over, and all the country wept with a loud voice. So as David was fleeing from Jerusalem, everyone passed by him, and among them were the Kerethites and the Pelethites and the 600 Gittites. And so we're not given the total number of the soldiers that passed before him, but we know in 2 Samuel chapter 17 that Ahithophel, who was the advisor to Absalom, recommended that he send 12,000 men to attack David while they were fleeing. So we can conclude that there were less than 12,000. In 2 Samuel chapter 18, it says that David numbered the people, and he put captains over the thousands and captains over the hundreds. And then later, he set commanders over a third of each of that army. So from that, you can tell there's at least 6,000, because for there to be a captain, there's got to be at least 2 under them, right? Or otherwise, they're the commander. So there's at least multiple thousands, 6,000 at the least, but less than 12. But still a pretty good amount of soldiers passing by. So of this contingent, there's these Pelethites, Kerethites, and Gittites. So who were they? Well, the first time we read about them is in Genesis chapter 20 and Genesis chapter 26. And that was when Abraham and his son Isaac had a run-in with Abimelech the first and his son Abimelech the second, who is the king of the Philistines in Gerar. So it's funny, I remember reading this, before I studied this, and reading the word Philistines in Genesis and kind of thinking, oh, wow, I didn't really think of the Philistines being there that long ago, because then the Bible's kind of quiet about them for a while, you know what I mean? Like when the Israel first comes into the Promised Land. But this is the first mention of them, and these were the Pelethites. These Philistines had one king, and they were somewhat peaceful at that time. And Abraham and Isaac didn't have too much trouble with them. And you can see the similarity in the word Pelethite with like the word Philistine or Palestinian or, and so forth. So the Kerethites, on the other hand, originated from Caphtor, according to Amos chapter 9, verse 7. But in several other passages in the Old Testament, so Kerethites and Pelethites are actually mentioned 10 times in the Old Testament. For example, Ezekiel 25:16, they're also referred to as Philistines. So Caphtor itself was historically from Crete. So I'm going to go to this busy chart. You probably can't see it all. But this chart was made by a professor from the University of Michigan. So this is a secular chart. And it shows the invasion of the Sea Peoples from 1250 to 1150 BC. So what you can take away from this is the Aegean Sea, up there by where Greece meets Turkey, all the red arrows kind of going out from it, that was the Sea Peoples invading the land. So this all happened during the time of the Judges in the Old Testament. And so the Sea Peoples, who were part of these Kerethites, they went through Syria, they went through Palestine. Nobody resisted them. They defeated everyone in their wake. And they finally went to Egypt, and Ramses II defeated them there. So after they were defeated in Egypt, they sort of fell back to no man's land, which was where the Philistines lived, and they created a unified kingdom with the Philistines. And so they went from one king to 5 lords or 5 kings. And those cities were Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. And we'll see a picture of that on the next slide. So as I said, this was during the time of the Judges. And you'll notice, like when you're reading your Bible, all of a sudden the Philistines rise out of nowhere. Well, that was the reason. It was because there was this big immigration of these Kerethites that were invading the land. And so eventually they all just consolidated and made this powerful Philistine kingdom. And it was during that time, in Judges chapter 13, it says that the Philistines ruled Israel for 40 years, and then that's when Samson was born. And Samson was born around 1120 BC. So you can see where secular history coincides with Bible history. It all works together. So the 2 big takeaways from this are that first, the Kerethites and the Pelethites were Philistines. So why doesn't the Bible just call them Philistines, if that's what they are? Well, it's because Philistia is the country they're from, but their ethnicity is Kerethite and Pelethite. So when these people went over and became troops in the Jewish military with Israel, they were no longer Philistines. They were Hebrew proselytes. So they referred to them by their ethnicity, which was Kerethite and Pelethite. And then they also, part of being a proselyte means they were Jewish converts. So they practiced Judaism as well. The other second key takeaway is that the Kerethites and the Pelethites that were fleeing with King David were part of his personal bodyguard, or what the Romans would refer to as the Praetorian Guard. So how do we know this? Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 17 through 18, it tells us that Joab was the commander of the army, and Benaniah was the commander of the Kerethites and the Pelethites. So the scriptures make the distinction between the army and the Kerethites and the Pelethites. And then 2 Samuel chapter 23 tells us that Benaniah was over the guard. And so this makes sense why the Kerethites and the Pelethites are fleeing with King David when he leaves the city, right? They're part of the king's guard. Of course they're with him. They're already there, and like on active duty, if you will. It also makes sense why later, when Adonijah, who was one of the other sons of King David, who tried to make himself king, and remember David said that Solomon will be king instead, well, it says in the scriptures that the Kerethites and the Pelethites went and got Solomon and brought him to Gihon, where Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed him king. So this begs the question, why would King David not only be allied with Philistines, but have them as part of his personal bodyguard? I mean, that's pretty crazy when you think about the history, right, of the Bible. Furthermore, there were 600 Gittites. So who were the Gittites? Well, Gittite means you're from Gath. And if you remember in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4, Goliath was from Gath. So these 600 Gittites, and the guy we're talking about tonight, Ittai the Gittite, he was from the hometown of Goliath. And so he's fleeing with David when David's looks like he's about to lose his kingdom. And you've got people like this that are staying loyal and following David. So it's pretty profound. Back to let me add one more point. So it seems kind of strange, but honestly, most armies back in this day had a specialized contingent of mercenary soldiers. And so the Persians had the 10,000 immortals. The Greeks under Alexander the Great had Persian mercenaries. The Romans did it as well. The Ottoman Empire had janissaries. So all these ancient kingdoms would take the best foreign troops that they actually fought against, and they'd kind of make them a specialized military unit. And so it sort of showed a power over them as well. I'll just pick up from there. I forgot my train of thought there. Oh, the other part I was going to say was that the other thing is you couldn't afford to have a full-time army. So the Israelites, couldn't be just sitting there like today, how we have an active military force. Like the Israelites were out farming and tending their land and producing for the nation. So they would be called up in time of war, but the king's guard was there all the time. So back to the story of Ittai. As they're fleeing, the king says to Ittai the Gittite, "Why are you also going with us? Return and remain with the king." Right? They're the king's guard. They should remain with the king. "For you are a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. In fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today, since I go I know not where? Return and take your brethren back with you. Mercy and peace be with you." So David wasn't trying to tell him to leave. He was trying to give him an honorable way out. He tells him that he's a foreigner and an exile. Remember in verse 22 that we read earlier, Ittai and the Gittites also have all their women and little ones with them as they're fleeing. David said, "You came only yesterday." We know that this wasn't literal. I mean, he could have been on leave and maybe he just got back the day prior, but this wasn't like his first day on the job. And we can infer that from the fact that David recognizes him and calls him by name, right? If he just got there the day prior, how's the king going to know this guy's face and his name that's not even an Israelite? Secondly, later on, he appoints him to command a third of the entire force for this crucial battle. So if this is a foreigner that just arrived the day prior, you're not going to put him in charge of a third of your army, when you're going to attack. So this is someone David knew and trusted. And lastly, as we read before, Benaniah was the commander of the Kerethites and the Pelethites. So he actually put Ittai over Benaniah. So who is Benaniah? Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 20 through 23, we read just what kind of man he was. So chapter 23 is the list of the warriors for David. There's the three, and then the three that did not attain to the three, and then the 30, if you remember. And so Benaniah was part of that second group of three. So if you think about all the people of Israel, I mean, he's like top 6 on the warriors under David. It says Benaniah was the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man from Kabzeel who had done many deeds. He'd killed 2 lion-like heroes of Moab. He'd also gone down and killed a lion in the midst of a pit on a snowy day. And he killed an Egyptian, a spectacular man. The Egyptian had a spear in his hand, so he went down with him with a staff, wrested the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and killed him with his own spear. So I love this story because it's like, so he kills these Moab warriors. For the Egyptian, it's like, well, it'd be too easy to just, fight him with a weapon. So I'll go down and take his weapon from him and kill him with his own weapon. And then the lion, it's scary enough to face a lion, but he jumps in the pit with the lion to kill it. And then he does it on a snowy day, so there's no traction, you're slippery, that takes someone with a lot of guts. So what you can see is that this is a, amazing kind of warrior guy. That's a leader of Israel. And so the fact that he put Ittai the Gittite over him to command the troops during that crucial battle, tells you a lot right there. And later, Benaniah was back over the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and he was the one later who was told to put Joab to death And then Benaniah became the commander of the whole army of Israel. So this guy was a pretty amazing guy, and we could just do a lesson on him as a Bible hero. So this begs the question, how did King David not only ally himself with the Philistines, but actually use them as a full-time bodyguard? And so where did he meet them? Well, if you remember when he was fleeing from Saul, he went to Gath, to King Achish, right? And Achish gave him the city of Ziklag, which was a small city to the south of Gath. And from there, David attacked the enemies of Israel. And so while he was there, he also had 600 people with him. But we know from other scriptures that these were also Israelites. But there were some people from the Philistines as well. But I think one of the reasons the Philistines kind of came over to his side is because if you remember in 1 Samuel chapter 30, the Amalekites came through and they kidnapped all the women and children of Ziklag, and then they took off with them. And so then David and his 600 chased them down. And remember, he had to leave 200 behind, and the 400 went after them. And then they had victory over them. They got all the captives back, and they brought them back to the city of Ziklag. And so it was no doubt that times like this, showed those Philistines that Jehovah was with David. He no doubt rescued their wives and their children, from that city of Ziklag. So it was times like this that showed them that God is with this man. That's where the loyalty, I think, came from. So continuing with the story, Ittai answers and says, "As the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also your servant will be." So why was Ittai a hero? Well, first of all, he was loyal. And we just talked about that loyalty, right? It came from the fact that he was loyal to God. And he recognized that David was the anointed of God. But he was loyal no matter what. He had integrity. Integrity means doing the right thing no matter what. And so he could have taken the easy way out. King David gave him an honorable way out. But he chose, to do what he believed was the right thing, even if it potentially meant the lives of his men and the lives of his little ones who were fleeing with him. And this leads to the final point, that Ittai was brave. He was given command over Benaniah of 1/3 of the total force. And this resulted in a victory. There were over 20,000 of the enemy slain. So it may have been 6,000 that killed 20,000 of the enemy. But Ittai himself may have died in the battle, because we never hear from him again in the scriptures. He's never mentioned. But what the scriptures do is they preserve his memory as a memorial for his loyalty, bravery, and integrity. When I think about the response of Ittai that we just read there, I can't help but think of another Bible hero who had a similar response. And if you think of Ruth's response, you put them up there side by side. Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried." So now imagine David, right? Who is Ruth to David? It's his great-grandmother. And so David would have been very familiar with the story of Ruth. I mean, that was his great-grandmother, and that was how that's how he traced his lineage back to Abraham, and the whole lineage of Christ goes through Ruth and through Boaz. But he would have known this story. And so him sitting there as he's fleeing Israel, hearing this statement, just like it was from Moab, now you've got a Philistine saying something like this. I know that that gave him hope in that time, that low time for him. And so what's interesting is that these traits, bravery, integrity, and loyalty, they are the traits of a hero, whether you're a man or whether you're a woman. Those are Christian traits of Christian heroes. They're the John Wayne type traits. They're the traits of a hero who's willing to do whatever's right, no matter what the cost. That's the idea of living by faith, of walking by faith and not by sight. That's exactly what that means. You know, when I look around at the audience, there's a lot of you I've already grown and know. And there are heroes in this audience. There are Christian heroes. And for the rest of us, we need to aspire to look up to them and to be heroes ourselves, to step up. And so I want to leave you with that message. You know, try to look up to these heroes and try to emulate true Christian heroes and try to be like them. We need more heroes. That concludes my lesson tonight. The invitation is always open, though. If you want to come forward and be baptized, wash away your sins, calling upon the name of the Lord, you always have that capability. So if there's anything you need, if you want the prayers of the congregation, if there's anything we can do, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.